I want most of this to be discussion, so I'm going to go through a few slides very, very quickly, primarily to sort of set a few definitions and maybe control a few expectations. But I think the topic says it very well, and the operational words in here are basically mean science and doing. And that's what we want to concentrate on. And let's see. Does this thing work?
Right here.
Right here.
One second here, I have to take a
Okay. Somebody has to actually connect me, and this works. Okay, so for point of argument, we'll put up a dictionary definition. This is not a real good one. It's not a real bad one. But science can be defined, this is from the Oxford American Dictionary, if there was ever a contradiction in terms. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And at least I think all of the important words are in there. Essentially, we start out by studying something. And we get observations or data or whatever you want to call them. And trying to make sense out of those observations and data gives us a theory or a model or something that we can sort of say, we understand it because we can make something that is almost but not quite exactly unlike what we observed. And so we use those artifacts to try to predict things. And then we run experiments to test the predictions, and invariably something goes wrong, and so we get new observations because there are things that weren't explained properly or were predicted that didn't happen or weren't predicted and did happen. And so we start this, and you can make a whole career of this in one very narrow area if you go about it right. So there are two things here, and I copied the first two bullets up there from Roy's website because I think they are very, very good. Pay attention to details. Quite often, either the details aren't paid attention to, or perhaps they are, but we have no evidence of it in the papers that we get. And so we can't do anything with it. The other one is don't make stuff up. And I remember a wonderful bloodbath many years ago in the formal verification area, where the August institution that was our host had worked on formal verifications of nucleonic systems for a decade. And finally, a new contracting officer decided there should be a peer review of this work. And he basically found everybody who had an axe to grind with the principles of the project and brought them together at Georgia Tech. I had just gotten my PhD. I was a brand new researcher, and I got invited to this thing for some strange reason. And it was absolutely amazing, because people started asking questions. People who knew where the bodies were buried started asking questions about how did you get this through the theorem proven? And it turned out, well, we didn't. We cut up the theorem in pieces with Emacs, and we proved each individual piece, and we believe that, the whole thing's been proven. But the claim in the journal article was that you mechanically proved. How does cutting it up with Emacs amount to mechanical proof? And so it went on like that. It was absolutely great. That's a minor example of making stuff up. We see data sets made up out of whole cloth and so on. So the first one is the key to science. Paying attention to details is absolutely one of the key things that we have to do. And I claim that the second one separates scientists from charlatans. And so we have to be very careful about making stuff up, because not only can you damage your own reputation, but you can actually really damage the whole field. I think program verification is set back 2 decades by that work, because everybody would claim from then on, well, this has been done, it's in such and such a paper, so you haven't done anything new by doing it. And so lots of people who actually did the work later could never get credit for it because it had already been done and published.
So it sounds like one of the key things is peer review as well.
Well, we'll talk about that this afternoon. Within that guidance, there's a lot of latitude, but there are limits. You've got a lot of flexibility there, and what we want to do is explore those limits and see how the community is doing and to see if we can do better. And that's what my hope and Roy's hope and the other organizers of the conference hope is, that we'll make some progress in this area. Now, I probably ought to stop there, but I'm going to run through a couple of things here because it really is important, and Ed caught it very, very well. And part of it is that the science of security, it's a stretch to put it into the same frames as rocket science or physics. You know, the purest of the sciences. As a physics major, I can claim that. So the physical science research and a lot of the social science research comes out of a paradigm that Mill set forth in his system of logic. And I have not read the book, but I have read some fairly detailed accounts of it, and I'm going to put the book on my retirement reading list so I can find out where I went wrong. You know, it's a big one. I'll refer to a book which does a pretty good job of summary here towards the end of this. But basically, in his method of difference, which is quite rigorous, there's an inductive form of the logic in which you try to find counterexamples to things, and until you exhaust the space, either literally or by induction, on things, and you come to the conclusion that your hypothesis has to be right because there's no way to find anything that's wrong about it. That's real nice, but it really requires a lot of control. And a lot of control is something we don't have the luxury of doing in much of what we do. There are a few cases where we can do it, but this is the root of one of our big problems in doing science and claiming science. So the question we've been asking is there a science in computer security or computer science? And I'm going to lump computer science in here because I don't see any difference in the problems that we face. Computer security is not unique in this aspect. It's unique in some other aspects, but it's not unique in this. So, you know, I grew up in Paul Methodist era, and I still like the idea of proving programs correct. But what can you prove about, say, the Windows operating system, or if you don't like that, OS X, or if you don't like that, pick your favorite Linux. Can you tell me what it's supposed to do with any degree of precision, so that I can even ask those questions of is it doing it? With Windows 7 and its successors, can you even run repeatable experiments to estimate its behaviors? And does the answer change depending on whether or not the system you're trying to run it on is connected to the internet? The last time I tried to run Windows 7 in a virtual machine on my Macintosh, I had to cut the internet off because it kept trying to change itself in the middle of my trying to get a report out. And so I'm running an unpatched system from 17 years ago, basically, or something like that. The systems are too complex for systematic variation approach to the inductive logic. It just isn't feasible for questions in large. And doing an experiment often changes the conditions so that you can't get back to the initial state for the experiment to run and make another run of it, much less vary it in any systematic way. The other problem is we're dealing with an adversarial world. And often our adversaries abandon attacks before we even figure them out. There were some wonderful stories about money laundering in an NPR story the other day, and the guy got some information on how the money was being laundered by the Cali cartel, put it in his book, went back to talk to his source later, and said, "Are you upset with me for doing that?" He said, "No, we weren't doing that anymore when we told you about it. We told you what we were doing today, and we'd have to kill you." You know, that's a common phrase in our group, so it's nice to know that there are other people use it as well. Often, we can't figure out how to get permanently workable solutions against stupid attacks, much less against really sophisticated ones. So now a slight digression, but this gets to the heart of what Deb was talking about. That we have behavioral social science versus human social research. And behavioral social science is sort of the child of Mill's logic applied to social problems. And you get, when you can do experiments that way, you get very small experiments about very special cases, and they don't generally relate in any useful way to the real world. And that concept of relating to the real world is called ecological validity for an experiment, and we just don't have much of it in a lot of the stuff we do. The jokes that start with "consider a spherical chicken" are a class of jokes that lack experimental validity here. I think the same can be said for a lot of experimental work in computer science. The computer-human interaction area is a prime example. CHI has very high standards of experimental rigor for accepting publications. There's tremendous pressure on graduate students and faculty members to do 4 or 5 publications a year. You can do 4 or 5 CHI class experiences that demonstrate absolutely nothing, but you can't do one that demonstrates anything useful with a year's worth of effort. And 4 or 5 years for a large system study ain't going to get you a PhD, it ain't going to get you tenure. It gets you respect from people like Roy and me, but that's not worth anything in the financial market.
John, are you, I'm not sure if I understand, are you holding up CHI as a good example?
No, I'm holding up CHI as an example of what's gone wrong.
Okay. I'm just double checking.
Yeah.
So
Jerry
are
and
there
I
any good
think-
examples anywhere?
Hmm?
Are there any good examples anywhere then?
I can't think of any offhand. I have seen a few papers in my 30 years or so in the field that I would say are fairly decent, but the general standard is extremely poor, and the contrast with other fields, even fields that are fairly soft, like some of the biological areas and so on, are much better. When you read a paper on the synthesis of a compound and the analysis that was done to show that you actually got the compound, and everything down to, in some cases, the batch numbers for the reagents and the serial number of the instrument that was used are in the paper in the methods section. It's a very, very dense methods section. But I could say, oh, but I happen to know, I used to own that serial number machine and it had this calibration problem, and these results are completely bogus unless that's been fixed. Or, you know, I got some of that batch of reagents and you know, they were contaminated. You can do that sort of thing from looking at and reading the paper. In many cases, I don't know the configuration of the browser that was attacked in the examples. I don't know the configuration of the operating system. I don't know what patch levels were there and so on. That's not considered relevant by our field, but it is part of being able to replicate the experiment and sometimes being able to account for results that don't seem to be quite right. So we have a lot of problems here.
I can add to this that somebody reported to me maybe a month ago, having had his paper rejected from the Oakland conference because he thought that it was important to relate some of the methodological details of the experiment they conducted. And the program committee didn't think that that was important and considered that part of the paper boring, and they rejected it.
He's in good company.
Let me interrupt real quick.
Yeah.
Some of the people online are having trouble hearing, so we're going to stick this lavalier mic on.
Okay, fine.
And then we're going to run the mic so that people can hear the folks in the audience.
Okay, that works. So I am now bugged. And so this will make Deb's job easier. You know, it's really nice to be among old friends because I can say things like that without getting my head handed.
At least in public.
At least in public, yeah. I'll get my head handed to me in private, but that's okay.
John, we have a question from the webcast.
We do, all right.
Yes. They ask, are you aware of any tools that would collect all of the information you think is necessary?
Yes. The human brain, a pencil and paper. Okay? This is not hard. It is tedious, but it is not hard. You know, there are configuration reporters. I don't know that I trust them. So, you know, we do a lot of work in discovering the configurations of systems that people have on the network, inferring it from the way they behave. That generally surprises the person who owns the system, what it's got out there, or even what they're running on their network. So I would say that this is a matter of attention to detail, and that is, at this point, a human thing. Roy?
Yeah, so I find this question a little bit disturbing. And the reason, I find this question a little bit disturbing. And the reason is because there seems to be a propensity in the computer science community that if you don't have a tool to do the dirty work, then the dirty work just isn't going to get done. And sometimes the dirty work requires the mechanism that John just mentioned. You just got to use your head, take a piece of paper and a pencil, and write down the details of how you did your work. This is the way it's done in virtually every other field. So I don't see why it is that computer science requires tools to do the dirty work.
Roy, we're lazy.
That said, I know we're lazy. That said, if there were tools, well, okay. But until there are tools, just write it down.
Yeah. Okay,
What about
so-
the validity of the tools?
Well, yeah, there's that too.
So I'd like to comment on this discussion that I wonder you're gonna get up. So what is computer security field? So Roy has been talking about this community. So what is this community? So I would argue that those who do cryptography, publishing crypto, are quite happy with their rigor in what they do. And most people who do then cryptographic protocols, because they want proofs in their work. Where it gets more fussier is what we often call system security. Oakland is an example of that conference. Now Chi, where you actually consider humans as part of the system, yes, it gets even more fussier because lots of the people who do the work don't have the background in the methods, say, that psychologists would have. And then psychologists also have a tradition of arguing and writing books about their methods for lots of years. So I'm reading one book now that dates 30 years back, where it's a commentary on statistical inference for behavioral sciences. So so with this discussion, it's not clear what is the commentary really against or for. And one of the things seems to be missing that, well, in computer science, we don't write books about, well, what's going on in our field. Or if this is even computer science, like I said.
As far as I know, and Sammy can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm the only person who has ever published a critique of work in computer security. And if you don't believe it, there are 22 blank pages in the first DISIX proceedings. You know, revenge is a dish that's best served cold, and so the paper did get published later in RAID and was picked up by the ACM Journal on Trusted Systems. And so it got far wider publicity than it ever would have if it had appeared in Sammy's admirable conference that he ran out of his DARPA projects on it. I think to answer your question, a precise definition of computer security is really not the point here, because the pure cryptographers are largely mathematicians. They just happen to have found an area of mathematics that happens to be useful to a community and pays them handsomely in an area that they otherwise wouldn't make a living in. The applied crypto people and the protocol people often fall into the same things. The protocols that can be tractably analyzed are usually not nearly as complex as the ones we actually have to run on the wire. And so they fall into this same problem the social science people have. If we do anything with rigor, we have to do it with a toy example, and the ecological validity is a real good question. I'm not a protocol analysis expert, so I could be off base on that, but I see enough nods around the room to make me suspect that I'm saying things that are reasonably accurate here. The Chi people, again, you know, yes, many of them are not psychologists, many of them are, but the real problem is that to get a paper into Chi, you have to have a level of rigor that would practically satisfy most experimental psychology journals, and that combined with the pressure to get many results in short periods of time precludes you from doing any more than one of the 20 examples. And so I think the problem follows. I'm trying to claim here that I think most of what we do in computer security and a large part of what we do in computer science is in fact closer to the social sciences than it is to the physical sciences. And the counter argument might be, well, it's actually mathematical science, programming and so on. And as an old formal methods person, I would really like to believe that, but and in fact, I use those concepts to make me a somewhat better programmer than I might be otherwise. But in fact, I can't go through a really rigorous proof of any useful program that I could write. The last one I did that for was a data acquisition system that I wrote in the 1970s in assembly language, and I did a rather rigorous proof, and the proof of the pudding was that it ran for the lifetime of the equipment without anybody finding any errors in it. So I don't care whether it actually had some that didn't manifest at that point. The proof was good enough to keep the ones that would have torpedoed several $100 million worth of oceanographic experiments and meteorological observations out of the water. We can do small properties of large programs, large properties of small programs. We don't do either one very often or well. There is absolutely no excuse for a buffer overflow, because that happens to be something that is tractable to formal analysis. So why do we have them? Because we don't bother to even use those kinds of tools in that limited context. Software engineering research is really research about human behavior, and a lot of the other stuff, and computer security is worse, because we have people on two sides of the equation, they're fighting with each other. And an adversarial situation is a really hard one in which to do any kind of research, much less rigorous social science research. So, we've got ecological validity with the BSS approach, which requires a degree of rigor that's just not obtainable in most real-world cases. There are exceptions, but for the most part, it's just the way it works. So what are we supposed to do? Well, there's another approach to it, which is called HSR, Human Social Research. And it's really more suitable for the study of really complex systems and interactions, but it's weaker. It provides a flexible framework, but rather than starting out with a hypothesis and sticking to it, as you proceed, your hypothesis may well evolve as you start to collect data. Oh, the question I set out to ask really isn't the right question. It ought to be phrased this way. Then maybe it ought to be phrased that way. Questions that really appeared important at the beginning of the study may be irrelevant once you start to understand what's going on. And the real purpose of this kind of investigation is to get understanding, not to prove a point, but to get something that will let you, in the end, say you have explanations for things that you didn't understand at the beginning, and you have evidence that until it is supplanted by better evidence of something else, it's a good working sort of framework. Nonlinear effects are taken as a given. Punch it a little bit here, and the wheel falls off over there. Butterfly flaps in a hurricane develops. Those kinds of things happen in the real world in strange ways. The other thing is that the influence of the observer is acknowledged. In many cases, the researcher is participating in the experiment in some way. And it's often very hard to keep the researcher out of it, so that you need to recognize that that is happening, and that running the experiment once changes the initial conditions so that you can't get kind of absolute reproducibility that you'd like to get. And as you see, these are just-in-time slide preparation. So I was able to add into the end the fact that Deb was really making the point very nicely in response to some of the questions that Roy asked. Okay, but the problem is that this doesn't absolve us from paying attention to detail, which was the point where we started. Keeping meticulous records of everything, including the things that you don't think are important now. Because quite often, the factor that you said, oh, that couldn't possibly influence it, is exactly the one it is. You also need a logic. You've got to be able to reason in some explainable, reproducible, repeatable fashion about what's going on. And there are logics that are considerably more flexible than Mill's hard form of logical differences for the BF sets. The bottom line is there's a lot of room to do good science in a variety of ways. It's not a single framework, but good work has common threads, and the don't make things up and pay attention to details are two of those common threads. Yes, Andy?
So in your first bullet, sorry. On your first bullet, in physics, one could record the quantum state of every particle in one's experiment, right, in all of its various colors and spins and stuff, and the amount of data that you would collect about that particular state from one femtosecond to another would fill up, every computer we have after about 4 to 5 seconds worth. So, I mean, in some sense, these complex objects that you're talking about have a similar property. If I recorded every single state that could be relevant, that seems like you have to have a theory of what's relevant, right? So attention to detail has to include a theory of what details matter in this particular context.
Yeah, as usual, you're right. I'm overreaching in making that statement. But the principle is still that you can't just be cavalier about ignoring most of anything. One of the differences between your physics experiment and one of these is that there is some theory that is guidance for what is relevant and what isn't. And another problem that we have is that there is a real lack of any fundamental theories. I mean, I can't even give you a real definition of what it means for a system to be secure without getting into a huge amount of detail about the system. But I can say 32 feet per second is not just a good idea, it's the law. And, it's a good approximation to the law anyhow, it's one that's useful. So we have to use a little bit of common sense on this, but we also have to recognize that we are dealing with a very complex problem, and it may drift in ways we didn't anticipate on that. So, Roy?
Yeah, just in response to Sammy's question, I think what you said is right. You can't record everything from one femtosecond to the next. And in practice, of course, no one, not even physicists, do this, right? But, the old adage of standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before us is apropos here, because what you do is you record the details that you can imagine are relevant to whatever experiment you're doing. You do the best you can. Then you publish this result, and maybe somebody else says, but there's this other detail here that was overlooked. Yeah. And then they do it in consideration of whatever that detail was, and that's how science moves forward.
And, without having shoulders to stand on, you want them standing on the toes of the people in front of you, and that's both uncomfortable to them and not very fruitful in what you do. A lot of what I've said here has been influenced by the book that was mentioned there at the bottom, and we'll get you just a second here. And so I would recommend that people take a look at this or similar books. This one is written for a layperson, so you don't have to be a behavioral or social scientist to understand what he's saying, but he talks a good bit about the origins of the HSR approach and how it is applied in real social science areas. And I think it has a lot to tell us about the kinds of experiments we might want to run when they involve people in the loop in one way or another. And almost all things we do with security involve people in the loop in one way or another. So I think it's generally fairly applicable. You had a comment.
Yeah, I'm curious. So we've had a lot of talk so far about the quote-unquote hard sciences a little bit in terms of inspiration, and I'm wondering I'm pointedly wondering if perhaps we're looking at the wrong inspiration for our source. I think the human subjects research is a little bit closer, and I'm curious if there's actually an idea I've been toying around with that I would toss out to yourself in the room is there seems to be evidence-based medicine seems to have a lot of corollaries to what we're doing. So drug research seems to, or medical procedures and the research on medical procedures and their efficacy, those two areas seem to have a lot more in common with how we are attempting to do computer security currently than, say, physics or chemistry or things like that.
Yeah, much of that research has been an attempt at the BSS model, and it works in limited ways. And Agar's book has a good bit of commentary on that that I think is particularly useful. I have a copy of it at the back of the room, and Simon has a copy on his iPad back there, so anybody who wants to take a quick look through it is more than welcome to do that. But I think the point is well taken. There are other fields that come much closer, and there are some very serious differences. You know, the disease that we're trying to treat usually isn't actively trying to escape us, although rapidly evolving viruses present that kind of a problem. But that's a mechanism that I don't have a real good handle on. But if you had a virus that said, I know what this drug is doing to me and I know what I can do to avoid it, and so the entire population would change at once rather than a few random individuals showing up resistance to the drug and then becoming the survivors in the evolutionary sense. You know, but it's going along the right way. Roy, I think, has his hand up again. Is there anybody else that I've been overlooking? I tend not to see anybody who's straight down this line unless they really get active in the back. Okay, after Roy.
No, I was just waiting.
Oh, okay. You wave and you're likely to have a microphone in your hand.
Okay, give me a minute.
Yeah, just in response to what Nate said, I don't think it's actually, I don't think we are particularly holding up the physical sciences as great examples for us to emulate, other than in the regard that in the physical sciences and in, as Nate said, evidence-based medicine, there is this strong tendency to support your claims with evidence. And I think that's much more the key aspect of what we're talking about here, because a lot of people make claims on the basis of very thin or inadequate evidence. And I think that's more at the heart of the matter than emulating any particular of the science. Okay. That basically runs to the end of the slides, and I think we've already started some good discussions. So I'm going to shut up for a while if anybody else wants to say anything about this. And I am reminded about an experience that Roy and I had together a few years ago, which was deeply disturbing to me, and I think to him as well. And Roy was running a workshop that delved into some of these issues in connection with an IFIT meeting in Portugal. And we got a surprising amount of pushback from senior researchers in the dependability area who said, well, if my students actually had to document in detail what they did in their research, they wouldn't get enough publications to get a good job. And I'm thinking, yeah, so? But then I'm old enough to have grown up in an area where it was unusual for a PhD student to have published anything prior to the time they graduated. And my first publications came some years after I graduated and had nothing to do with my dissertation. I think we've somehow, the acceleration of our culture has done us a great deal of damage in doing these things because it's made it far easier to skate over doing things well in favor of doing things in volume. And, you know, I'm old enough so I can retire and never do anything more like this. I'm still active because I'm having fun. And arguing in things like this is part of the fun. So, but it really bothers me to see that we have produced a culture that sort of doesn't value what I consider good work. And that's hard. And there are a few people who still sort of try to carry on those traditions, and some of them are in the room here.
But Simon, you wanted to say
Well,
something?
And just for those that are speaking, the people on the web, you might want to say your name in case they don't recognize your voice.
Sure. Yeah, this is Simon O from Kansas State. So just a quick comment on John's remark on publication and the period that those publications tend to appear. So John and I are working with anthropologists on applying anthropological research methods to study security operations. We have a work in progress talk in the afternoon. So I was talking with our anthropologist collaborator. He was complaining to me on our pace of publication. He was saying, we are too fast in writing things up. And we had our probably first full publication on this work after 1.5 years of research that has already been happening. And he was complaining that is too fast, because in his field, normally it takes years of field work before they even start to write. So I mean, I don't think we want to go that far, but we want to rethink about, maybe it's a half a year a paper, really, is it really benefiting or damaging our research?
Shinkan Lau from Carnegie Mellon University. At the risk of broaching the topic for the panel I'm on this afternoon, I will mention that in terms of the publication rate, one thing that I often see as a graduate student when I talk to senior professors is that they all tell me that there's no reason I should be publishing so fast, right? That just to have 1 or 2 publications by the time you graduate is kind of good, as long as those publications are good. And then when I go and sit down with my colleagues who are on the job market, who are giving their job talks, they'll tell me things like, well, if you don't have 10 publications, you can't even you don't even get invited to give the talk. And I personally had feedback from scholarships that I've applied to that said, well, it appears you don't have any publications so far, but maybe next year you'll have a bunch of publications and then you can be considered for the scholarship. So I think and I'll touch on this more this afternoon, but I think there's definitely a tendency to say you need to publish a lot, you need to publish now, more. And the whole part about quality seems to have been lost in the mix.
Are you going to point to people that I should?
Yeah.
So as someone who recently graduated, I would agree that the paper publication mentality of computer science does not necessarily seem to align itself with evidence-based papers and quality publications in some regards. That being said, I would say to be careful to pick up some of the methods of the social sciences in the sense of very long publication periods followed by either a journal or the few conferences you go to, you sort of read off the paper. So I think there has to be, and there has to be a certain balance, because even it's difficult to sort of balance out say quality ethnography while maintaining the still relevancy of the work, given, as mentioned earlier, how fast the attacker populations change in response to our behaviors. Now, I guess the counterexample of that would be a longitudinal 1 or 2 year ethnography working with computer scientists and anthropologists would be great if we're actually studying how fast and rapidly they change compared when we put in defenses.
What?
I don't think the issue is the time to publication or the amount of time it takes you to write something up, whether it's 6 months or 18 months or 6 years or whatever. The issue is what it is that constitutes quality research and whether or not you have supported your claims with evidence. Now, it might take more time to do a careful claim analysis and ask yourself, what do I need to say here to support these claims adequately? So having said that, I just want to try to drag the conversation away from time to publication and these kinds of things, because some of that's going to come up this afternoon in Xinghong and Sammy's panel. But I think more to the point is, what does it mean to do quality research, evidence-based, evidence-supported research in cybersecurity, What does it mean to do good science? And in this community, is it being done or not? I think that's the key point that we need to address in our session here.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the issues again of doing good science and collecting data and recording it. And I think it might be useful to, as this field grows, to also look at other fairly young fields. So for example, some of the subdomains of bioinformatics. So for example, people that study expressions of genes, because of the technologies changing, over the last decade or almost two now, people that weren't used to can all of a sudden collect lots and lots of data. And it became a problem when individual labs could do that, and pretty soon there was a need to be able to share the data. And so the same problems crept up, that people were not adequately defining their experiments when they recorded the data, so it became unreproducible. And so the answer, I think, were some organizations formed to sort of define what should be reported, and there's something called the Miami Project, MIAME, which is where they really define what's the minimal information you need to report when you run a large gene expression experiment. And they define it, and in order to get your data out into public databases, which eventually happens in these fields, you have to report that. And I just think it might be good, as this field grows, to sort of look to some of those things and plan ahead of time so it doesn't become a problem. And I think this is true across all of the big data areas now. People are trying to figure that out. Just a comment.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'll just say that in other fields, not just the one that you mentioned, there are similar guidelines. So for example, in the medical field, there's the consort guidelines, right, which come out of Oxford. And these are very, very useful. And they lay out in detail what it is that you need to do to support the claims that are being made in your paper. We could do the same kind of a thing. Moreover, the review forms for those kinds of papers include not only those points, but also the page number for the reviewer to mark down on the review form where it is that this particular point is made. So nobody can gloss over this stuff. And maybe bringing that kind of rigor to the cybersecurity field would be helpful, as I think was your message.
This is Frank Kreitzer. I want to get back to the original question, because really, the question about what you should be reporting is important, but if we're not applying the correct scientific methods, then we may not even ever collect and record the information that we need to write about later. So really the fundamental question here is, and I'm not sure that I'm convinced, I'm a behavioral scientist. I haven't heard you say anything that makes me lean in a different direction in terms of what I would like to see or what I would require for this discipline to apply scientific method. I mean, the first two bullets in your presentation were really the ones we need to be concerned about. We need to have that attention to detail, and we need to apply a rigorous scientific method. Whether you want to call that a BSS method or a HSS method? HSR method. I haven't read the book, so I'm not sure. It sounds to me like maybe there's some nuances there. But even in this workshop, as a reviewer, one of the questions has to do with reproducibility. And I think it's a valid question. Notwithstanding those issues that you mentioned about how it's difficult to reproduce experiments, especially in our area, because we have particular problems like adversaries that are, trying to undermine the results. But I think that in the social sciences, we have similar challenges, and yet, we still require the use of rigorous scientific methods.
Hi, my name is Pratik Jayapurya, and I would like to discuss about this other view, right? People say, why don't you just publish out anything that you have to start a discussion on, like we have these work in progress sessions right here. And rather than trying to completely solve the problem, have a complete solution, as soon as you have something that you want people to start talking about, why don't you just push it out and start publishing that? And I don't know what's the view of others here.
So I think that's a very interesting idea. I think you see that from a lot of our very hacker industry-oriented counterparts who work for firms like Cigital or Accuvant and things like that, where they're usually going to their conferences and sort of publishing whatever they have. But again, the downside is, to get back to what Roy mentioned earlier, the idea of, well, even if we're doing that, we have to make sure whatever we have done and whatever we have put out there has a rigorous basis. And that is something that is currently lacking from some of those more industry-centric security conferences.
Yeah, short-term results over limited data sets.
This is Simon. I would like to get the audience opinion on what do we really aim for to obtain reproducibility for cybersecurity research. Do we mean reproducible under a controlled lab environment, or do we mean reproducible in some sense in the real world?
Could I just interject something here? Okay. I think the issue of reproducibility is an important one. That's the reason why we have a keynote talk on exactly that topic at 1 o'clock. So I wonder, not that I mean to discourage discussion about that right now, but what we're trying to decide here is, what does it mean to do good science in our field? Possibly reproducibility should be something that's included, but I just wanted to make a note that we have a very nice long session coming up at 1 on that topic exactly, which I think will make you happy.
So the fact that we're having this discussion sort of implies that we don't think we're all doing science, right? Otherwise, the answer would just be yes and we'd be over. So let me offer sort of a contrary observation. I do a lot of digital forensics, and I'm a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. AAFS has 13 disciplines, including digital forensics, but also dentistry and jurisprudence lawyers, right? Medical doctors, pathologists, all these interesting other people that do forensics. As it turns out, they think digital forensics is doing fine. And the courts sort of agree. They would say, look, you have papers, you have years of evidence, hashing methods are fine. We, as a digital forensics community, are very self-critical. We know we could do better. We know there's problems even with the things that are widely accepted by these other disciplines and the judges. But yes, some people are doing the exact definition that we put up at the beginning. It's not a semantic argument per se, and yes, many people are not doing the scientific rigor that they could be doing. But I think there's good examples of us actually doing it, and I think it's something to stand on in that regard.
Those that can't see Sammy's raising his hand, so he's going to have to wait for one. Sorry. That's right.
No, Carrie, you should go first.
Well, I am going to change the subject on you, though. So one of the observations I have is we were talking about reproducibility, which seems to imply a smaller sample size, which then has the potential issue of ecological validity. My question is there some way of releasing something out and then studying the ecological validity and properly documenting that in such a way that we learn lessons from what we're doing and can then apply those later?
Let me first, I want to respond to both of what y'all said. So I accept what you said about digital forensics, but I would point out that the National Academy of Sciences released a couple of years ago an utterly scathing report about forensics in the nation. So there seems to be some disparity here in the opinions that people have about the state of forensics. I don't know if you've read it. Absolutely. So you know what I'm talking about. And then Carrie, I think what you said is a great idea. I think we should do those kinds of things. I think it's a question of finding a way to encourage the community to accept an idea like what you have and to work on those kinds of things. So I think that's a terrific thing.
Let me interject something here in just a second, and then we'll go to Carol. The issue of recording how data was obtained is to be one of the really biggest ones. And for better or for worse, I'm a member of what used to be called the Predict Advisory Board, but there are rules against having an advisory board, so it's called something else these days. But it's basically oversight for the VHS Predict project. And since the very beginning of that project, I have been trying to get the criteria for contributing data sets to Predict to include enough detail about how the data was collected so that somebody who wanted to collect similar data in their own environment would be able to do a setup to do it. I think that's a reasonable standard, and it's one which really shouldn't be an immense burden. But to date, it has not happened. People are now just beginning to realize that, oh, this might be an important issue, and this is what, almost 10 years after Predict was on the drawing board.
Well, data with no context is not worth very much.
Well, you know, the argument is, well, this is PCAP data, and everybody knows what PCAP data is, right? Or this is flow data, and everybody knows what flow data is, or things like that. And, you know, yeah, I know what the format of it is, but that format is not the issue. The issue is where were the sensors placed, what were the bandwidths of the lines, is there a likelihood that data was missed because of overloading of the sensor and that wasn't acknowledged, you know, all sorts of things like that. So it's a real problem, and one that I'm trying to work on from there, and I strongly encourage anybody who is involved in data collection and distribution to try to work that problem, because it's a critical one. I think Terrell had his hand up, and then Simon, or Simon and then Terrell. I think over 2 minutes. Okay, we've got 2 minutes, so.
This is Simon. I just try to be quick. I once saw some medical research data where it was very clearly documented each patient's process getting treated, right? So, you know, how when the patient was checked in, what diagnosis was done, what diagnosis, what decisions were made, and then what was done. So it was used for medical school research, and somehow in the medical field, people were able to collect those data in a rigorous way. So I don't think this will be easily happening in computing or computer security, because I don't see a natural manual where there's already this kind of data being collected on a daily basis, because the system needs are very busy doing their job. If you ask them to document unlimited data, it's not going to happen. So I just don't know why we don't have a mechanism or institution in place to make that kind of data, happen.
Because we don't understand that these things make a difference.
Carol, I think you get the last word.
Terrell Taylor. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of work in sort of, aside from security, but more in sort of data mining and stuff like the things. And there's a couple of interesting conferences. One is BLDB, where they're starting to create sort of tracks, like experimentation tracks, where you actually go back, and they encourage you to go back and look at existing stuff and do comparison analysis and having a third party with basically with a couple of the big things that you need to do in this. One is you have to release your data set, and you have to release all of your code. And they can actually, before they accept the paper, they go and they send it to the original authors of the work that you're trying to compare. And I just find with security work, and even in a lot of other areas, people are trying so hard to come out with new stuff so fast, and a lot of it is incrementally over what existing has been out there, without really comparing it with other things. And I think that sort of looking at some of these experimentation tracks and encouraging some of these to come in, and encouraging people to do research that that can, go back and sort of do these comparisons would provide a lot of validity to some of these things and sort of encourage maybe better practices.
Do you want to make some concluding remarks, John?
I just want to thank the audience for a very informative and spirited conversation. This exceeded my expectations, so I'm very happy about this. Thank you all.
Thank you for.
Thank you.